Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we will focus on Russia's economic resilience. Otto von Bismarck once said that Russia is never as strong nor as weak as she looks. And honestly, that's exactly the vibe Moscow wants us to buy into. Since Putin started his invasion of Ukraine, the West has hit Russia with a blizzard of sanctions, aiming to cripple the war machine. And while they have absolutely had an impact, the Kremlin's propaganda apparatus insists that sanctions simply don't work. In fact, they claim they have somehow turbocharged the economy instead. But even Vladimir Putin, who has insisted that the Russian economy just keeps getting stronger, has shown that some cracks are appearing on the surface. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Money. The fuel that has run every empire since the dawn of man. Putin's is no different. As his war effort in Ukraine is taking its toll, ordinary Russians are feeling the heat. Prices are going up. Western sanctions are putting pressure on an economy that some say hadn't fully recovered from the Soviet Union's collapse. And the emergency raise of a key interest rate to 20% at the onset of the full-scale invasion has now gone up to 21%. The decision to hike it to that staggering number was unanimous.
The option of holding the rate was not considered. No one suggested it.
In a surprising turn of events, Vladimir Putin himself has admitted that his country is facing some economic difficulties. Although Russia has seen economic growth due to its sky-high military spending, inflation has been surging. Troop losses in the war in Ukraine, a depleted workforce, and severe brain drain have all contributed to rampant inflation. The central bank's latest decision is meant to help curb it, but some observers doubt whether this will help at all. This decision is seen as a scramble by the Russian government. Putin's attempts to alleviate the impact his conflict has had on Russia's economy can also be seen elsewhere. Russia has been tightening its cooperation with other BRICS members to offset Western sanctions. Whether the smile on Putin's face is genuine or won through pain is up to the near future of Russia's economy to decide.
And now, as always, we're zooming in on the issue to examine it in greater detail. The idea that Russia is thriving despite sanctions wasn't just a talking point for Kremlin loyalists. Pro-Russian actors in the West, as well as a surprising number of economists and analysts, have been parroting Moscow's rosy narrative, taking official Russian data at face value. Even the International Monetary Fund, not that long ago, praised Russia's economic growth, claiming it's outpacing most developed nations. But here's the twist. If you look beneath the surface, you will find that this economic growth is a bit like a house of cards. At first glance, Russia's economy looks like it's on fire, but in reality, it is caught in a spiral of structural issues. The Kremlin mobile is running on empty, hoping that with a little rusties and an insane amount of luck, they too can look like a real economy. Ka-chow. The cracks in the Russian foundations are widening, and although the ruling elite may appear unified on the outside, there is a growing division. Behind closed doors, some want to ramp up the war effort, while others are worried that they are pushing the Russian economy to a breaking point. The truth is that Western sanctions have hit hard, but the Kremlin has been cagey. Moscow adjusted its economy to survive sanctions by setting up new grey trade channels and pouring more funds into the military-industrial companies. And despite sanctions, Russian exports of raw materials, especially oil and gas, continue to line the government's pockets, thanks to many crafty workarounds. For instance, the Group of Seven placed a price cap on Russian oil at $60 per barrel, but that hasn't stopped the oil money from flowing in. However, these quick fixes don't change the fundamental problem. Russia is burning through its reserves and is increasingly isolated on the global stage. So what is keeping this shaky economy afloat then? First, Russia has always been more of a gas station than a technological powerhouse. And second, Western sanctions were pretty lenient until 2022, which gave Russia time to build up a bit of a cushion. But now the cushion is gone, and Moscow is struggling to make ends meet as sanctions tighten. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has been throwing money at the military-industrial complex, pushing defense spending to nearly 9% of GDP, at a staggering 30% of Russia's central budget. So, that so-called economic growth? It is not growth, it is the result of pouring cash into weapons production to artificially prop up the GDP. And while Putin may usually act unbothered, the Russian economy is feeling the pressure. Labor shortages are a growing issue. Hundreds of thousands have left Russia since Putin's partial mobilization last year, and the war has claimed countless lives, further shrinking the workforce. To cope, Russia's been raising wages across industries, creating a competition between the defense sector and civilian jobs. And that is driving up the costs. Not exactly sustainable, is it? Plus, the Kremlin has blown through most of its economic reserves. Governor Elvira Nabiullina of the central bank has even admitted that the country can't keep this up. With targeted sanctions now hitting Russian uranium, diamonds and metal industries, pressure is mounting and Putin's options are dwindling. The sad truth is that Russia is still able to wage this costly war thanks in part to Western indecision. However, time may not be on Russia's side after all. With Moscow having fewer young men to fight and their economy hemorrhaging cash, Ukraine's allies have a unique opportunity. If the right pressure is applied, the house of cards may finally come crashing down. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Benjamin Hilgenstock, senior economist at the KSE Institute Kiev School of Economics. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, my pleasure.
So the Russian economic resilience, to what extent is this a myth which is being relayed to everyone around the world by the Kremlin propaganda? And to what extent can we say, okay, the Russian economy has actually found a couple of ways to perhaps become less susceptible to Western economic pressure?
It's certainly true that the Russian economy has proven to be rather resilient. If we look at most forecasts for real GDP growth this year, most institutions like the IMF and others assume something like 3% growth or more. That for Russia is a rather good number. However, I think it's important to put this in perspective. There are several factors that play a role in making Russia this resilient, at least for the time being. One is, of course, that Russia is spending significant amounts of money on the war effort. So that's just direct fiscal stimulus. We should also mention that the Russian labor market is extremely tight for several reasons. First, the war economy is driving up demand for labor. But on the other hand, there's mobilization and there's emigration, and that has driven up wages. Has driven up wage growth that leads to robust consumption and hence drives economic growth. But these things are not without risks. There's side effects. These things create inflation, and also they're not necessarily sustainable over the medium term.
So you've mentioned the war economy. Now, it has been pointed out that the way that it differs from an ordinary economy is that, of course, it does manufacture certain goods and products, namely weapons for the war effort. However, these often get annihilated on the front lines fairly quickly, so they bring no economy to the ordinary citizens. Instead, they simply go up in flames. To what extent does this actually change the calculus here?
That's certainly true, but we shouldn't forget that the people involved in the manufacturing of these weapons that then get destroyed on the battlefield in Ukraine, they earn fairly good wages. The people that go to war are being paid higher and higher bonuses in order to sign up. And that means they're able to consume, and that drives economic growth. So this is not entirely about products that are essentially blown up in Ukraine a week later. So I think that's maybe an oversimplification.
So there is also inflation over 8%, which has actually risen from, I think, 6.7% the same time last year. To what extent do these indicators, these and other indicators, point towards the fact that, okay, the economy is doing fairly all right, given all the circumstances, but as you said, there is a question of sustainability. How long can it keep going that way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first on the point of inflation, there are several drivers of inflation, and the Russian central bank has found it rather difficult to get them under control. I already talked about the labor market, which is driving high wage growth. There is direct fiscal spending on the war. There's also kind of quasi-fiscal stimulus in terms of Russian banks, including a lot of state-owned ones, providing loans, often at subsidized rates, to both households and companies, including in the military industry, but also around that. That drives up inflation. The ruble has depreciated quite significantly over the last 2 years plus. That creates price pressures via import prices. Russia is also paying higher prices for goods that it still needs to import and that are sanctioned. And this has turned out to be rather sticky. You pointed out that inflation continues to rise. It has been significantly above the Bank of Russia's target for quite some time. And we shouldn't forget that the CBR has now raised interest rates to 21%, which in real terms, so subtracting inflation, is something like 12+%. That is extremely high, and that will, in the medium term, have an effect on economic activity because it just makes it much, much more costly for anyone to borrow and then invest or consume.
Would you just say that the situation is in any way comparable to that of the Soviet Union towards the end of its existence? Because some people have this wishful thinking, namely that, okay, the Soviet Union collapsed because of the arms race, perhaps Russia is going to do the same. But is it really something that may happen?
So I don't think so. There's no imminent collapse of the Russian economy on the horizon. There are also no imminent issues with funding of the war on the horizon. In September, for instance, Russia's federal budget cumulatively over the first 9 months of the year moved into positive territory. So there's a surplus. That means Russia doesn't really have any problems to stay within its budget target for this year, and that includes additional spending on the war, and most likely will also not have problems to then finance the additional spending that it's planning for 2025. So this is painful. There are side effects to the macroeconomic management that authorities, including the Bank of Russia, have to do. But this doesn't mean that in the next 6, 12, 18, or 24 months, the Russian economy is encountering any kind of situation that would really change the calculus of the regime.
So that's the big question. Do you think Russia is too big to fail? And I'm asking this for two reasons. One reason is whether its allies, like China, would be prepared to bail them out should they see that, some sort of really critical situation, the economy going into meltdown, Russia actually, standing on the brink of collapse. As you said, it's not likely to happen soon, but potentially. But the second issue is whether the West considers Russia to be too big to fail. And that is why they impose sanctions, but they don't want to impose sanctions at such a magnitude, which could result in some sort of catastrophic chain reaction, because the West, much like in military terms, is kind of uncomfortable with the idea of, Russia going, into a state of ungovernability and perhaps even starting, fracturing internally and, splitting apart into smaller states. Is this perhaps the key to what we're seeing today, to some extent at least?
So first of all, I think the notion that Russia is too big to fail, or rather too integrated into the global economy and financial system and too linked with countries that may support it, such as China, for instance, I think that notion is not correct. As Ukraine's allies, or what we call the sanctions coalition, we're definitely not at the end of the road. And in terms of this fear of Russia collapsing and disintegrating politically, and then you have like a nuclear state that is falling apart and ungovernable, I think that's an exaggeration, and it's a bit of fear mongering, to be honest. What we're trying to do with our sanctions is not to destroy the Russian economy and the Russian state. It is to, in a very targeted way, limit Russia's ability to finance this war, and to conduct the war in terms of its military production.
So
And
is this
here
approach
there's much
working?
more that-
Do you think this approach is working? Or is it perhaps insufficient at this stage?
I think both is correct. I think sanctions have definitely had a meaningful impact on Russia and have made it rather difficult for Russian authorities to manage the economy in this time of war and sanctions. But clearly, Russia's brutal war against Ukraine is continuing. Russian weapons continue to fall from the sky in Kiev and other cities in Ukraine on a daily basis. That means we haven't done enough. But the conclusion should not be that we can't do anything to achieve our objectives here. Rather, sanctions need to be understood as like a moving target. The adversary or the target of the sanctions will always adapt. And so we also have to adapt and sharpen our tools. And there's still a lot of room to do that when it comes to export controls, but also specifically when it comes to energy sanctions.
And speaking of adapting, it is impossible to ignore the Trump factor. Today, we're almost certain that Trump is going to become the 47th president of the United States. Do you think the approach to sanctions is going to change?
It may. I hate to speculate.
Have there been any signals, perhaps?
I think it's fair to say that that Donald Trump and those he surrounds himself with in terms of advisors have a different view of Russia and of this conflict. But we shouldn't forget that under the first Trump administration, meaningful sanctions were actually imposed on Russia, including on the Nord Stream pipeline. So the jury is kind of still out on that. And I think it's the job of the other countries in the sanctions coalition to make sure that the United States remain committed to this approach. Because I think one thing is clear, without economic sanctions that are effective, the remainder of our strategy with regard to Ukraine, financial support, military support, is also not going to be sufficient to defeat Russian aggression.
And that is a very important conclusion here. Europe cannot afford to descend into some sort of stupor. Instead, it must be galvanized into action because it has to be aware of the fact that the US may help in that effort, but this is no longer a foregone conclusion, and it does require additional efforts there. Benjamin Hilgenstock was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Ukraine and Poland are set on continuing their close cooperation. The latest evidence for this is the recent launch of the Ukrainian Legion, which is set to start training in Poland by the end of the year.
Sites like these from last year could become much more common in Poland this winter. As part of a bilateral agreement between Poland and Ukraine, the Polish armed forces are to be responsible for training the Ukrainian Legion, staffed with Ukrainians recruited by Kiev. Initially, there weren't many volunteers to join this initiative from Poland itself. But in just the last month, over 500 Ukrainian citizens from 30 different countries signed up. According to the agreement, Kiev will provide uniforms and medical supplies, while Warsaw will be responsible for infrastructure and equipment during the training period. It remains to be decided whether Poland will also equip the unit for its deployment in Ukraine.
And while Poland and Ukraine are focusing on training new warriors, Russia has been busy blowing things up. The Wall Street Journal reports that Moscow is behind an operation aimed at igniting fires on cargo on passenger planes bound for North America.
Parcels not unlike these were the target of Russia's latest scheme, according to Western officials cited by the Wall Street Journal. They say that explosive devices inside DHL parcels in Germany and the UK were ignited on November 5th as part of a test run of this ploy. And last month, Polish officials said that 4 people had been detained as a result of an investigation into parcels that had caught fire. Lithuanian officials have urged NATO to respond to these acts of sabotage, which they say have been organized by Russia. Moscow itself has not commented on the report or the accusations.
Meanwhile, Ukraine isn't just content with relying solely on much-needed aid from its allies to succeed in the war. The government in Kiev recently launched a low-interest loan program to boost domestic arms manufacturers' production capabilities.
Drones are arguably one of the most important weapons in Ukraine's arsenal. Their swift production and delivery to the front lines are vital to Kyiv's military effort. But on their own, they're not enough to win the war. Ukraine's government has a plan to boost arms production, up to $2 million loans for working capital for up to 3 years and up to 11 for 5-year investment projects, all with a 5% interest rate. The goal? To boost domestic production capacity and reduce dependency on foreign aid. To say that the latter has been crucial to Ukraine's successes on the battlefield is an understatement. And even this boost to domestic production won't change that. But it is expected to help Ukraine beyond the current war and serve as a step in safeguarding its future after the conflict ends.
And speaking of Ukrainian efforts to counter Russian aggression, there have been reports that Ukrainian GPS jamming tech has been affecting clocks in smartphones. Although it is an inconvenience for citizens, this technology is crucial in thwarting Russian drone attacks.
GPS jamming, or spoofing, is becoming an increasingly important part of modern warfare. NATO is already ramping up its efforts in this area, but Ukraine has been utilizing this tech for a while now, hoping to prevent attacks such as these. Both in Ukraine and in Russia, civilians have been experiencing various problems with their mobile tech due to GPS spoofing. The most notorious case is smartphone clocks being reset, or individual navigation devices showing them in much different locations. Although this is quite the annoyance in day-to-day life, GPS spoofing is one of Ukraine's best weapons in taking down Shahed drone strikes.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.